Welcome to the tutorial for the Findon skirt. We're going to start with the pockets. Just a tiny pocket on this skirt, and you can see here that angle is where the pocket's going to go. We've got two other pieces. This is the back pocket, which sort of goes behind so it makes up the rest of the waistline, and this bit is sort of the facing part for the front of your skirt there. We're going to put this piece on first. I'll just show you, look, there are notches there that match, so it's helpful to mark those before you start. Okay, so I've got a pair of fronts here. You can see on the wrong side I've put some interfacing, just a little strip. I like to keep my scraps for this purpose, it's really useful. So that interfacing will stop that stretching, and I just need to pin the pocket section to the front, right sides together. Let's pop some pins in there. I'm using a nice light viscose to make this skirt. I think it's one of the ideal fabrics. Now we're going to stitch 1 centimetre from the edge, little back tack to start, and then off we go. Back tack to finish. There we go. So that's a little pocket first stage done. Let's give that a press, and then we're going to stitch through that little pocket bit and all the seam allowance underneath. Just understitch it so that it holds it all inside the pocket, and it makes a really lovely crisp edge to your pocket. There we go. You can see that my fabric's pulled a little bit there. I will change my needle in a minute. So that now should roll really nicely and form a nice crisp edge. So we're just going to do that and give it a press. There we go. That's the first part of your pocket. So now we need this piece, the back pocket. Remember, you've got that notch there. So again, we've got a pair of these. Make sure you've got the right one. And you just want to match these curves together and stitch them. So that's going to be our first job. Again, centimetre seam allowance. Just follow the curve around. Okay, so we've stitched those two pieces together. Let's have a look. That's how it should look. And you can see from the front, you can see it's starting to take shape. So next I'm going to just finish this edge off. I'm going to use my overlocker. You can zigzag or use whatever finish you prefer. There we go, it looks much neater now. So now I'm just going to secure these layers together. So I'm pinning now, just to keep them all together, because there's sort of 3 layers here. It can be a little bit of a fiddle, but I'm just stitching within that centimetre seam allowance just to secure those pieces together, so that when I do the next stages it's much more simple to pop on the waistband, for example, because they're all already in place. I'm going to do the same here at the top. Look, quick pin, and then I just give them a stitch. Take those pins out. There we go. So you can see a little pocket there, just a nice easy little pocket. Just repeat that process for the other one. So next we're going to do the centre back seam. Here we go. This is my back panel. I've got one pair cut again, and I've got a notch on the side here. That's a single notch. And for the centre back seam, it's a double notch. So that's the edge we're going to be stitching. So I'm going to overlock these edges before I stitch them together. So I'm going to make sure I've got these panels the correct way up. They've got notches at the top where the waistband goes on, so I know they're both the right way up. It's quite easy to get a bit disorientated sometimes with the shape of these pieces. Stitching from the top to the hem, 1 centimetre seam allowance. Press the seam open. There we are, centre back seam done. So now we're going to do the same sort of principle but for the side seams. This is my back panel. So I've got the notches at the top again, so that's the waist, that's my side seam, that's my side seam. Okay, so I've overlocked these side seams again in prep. I've made sure that my notches are at the top where my waistband goes, so I'm working from the top down. This is my pocket side of my front panel. You can see the pocket there. I've just overlocked it again. So side seam, side back to side front, right sides together. Pop in a couple of pins. Incidentally, there's nothing wrong with tacking seams if that's something that makes you feel happier. Please do take the time. Starting from the waist down, centimetre seam allowance towards the hem. There we go, that's one side seam. Take those pins out. I'm going to press this open again. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to prep the waistband. Got 2 parts to your waistband here. There's a back piece which is to the fold and the front pieces which are separate. You've got a double notch there, that's the back waistband, so that matches the back skirt, and there's a single notch for the front waistband which matches the front skirt. Now, actually, I'll put that back there. This is on the straight grain, so you need to make sure you've got your fronts together because the side seam bits are on the bias, which is not good. So I'm going to open out the back waistband and I'm going to match the side seams. Just double check that. Yeah, that's my fronts, that's my side. And put one of these waistbands together. Let's get rid of that other one for the minute. Pop a pin in so you don't lose the correct sides on your way to the machine. So again, centimetre seam allowance. Pop those together and I'm going to press that seam open. There we go. You can see it sort of naturally curves. So the side seams I'm just popping together now. I'm just going to mark the centre back because again this will help me when I'm putting the waistband onto the skirt, so I can match that to the centre back seam. Okay, so now we're going to stitch the upper edge of the waistband. This is the part that is on the top. The inside curves go together, the outside curves attach to your skirt. So matching the side seams here. Incidentally, you can see I've interfaced with a really light interfacing just the fronts of my waistband, the outer and the inner, because I want that to lie nice and flat. I haven't with the back because it's going to be gathered up and I don't want it to be too bulky. So we've matched the top curves, pinning them together, and we're going to stitch right the way along to the end. Centimetre seam allowance. Here we go. So I'm now going to just snip into just the front waistbands because they're curved. The back is on the straight. And I'm going to grade the seam allowance down by half. So I'm just going to cut that down one side to half the seam allowance. There we are. So grade that all the way along, and then I'm going to open it out. I'm going to press my seam allowance over towards the side that I've graded, that I've snipped down. I'm going to stitch on the edge there through all the seam allowances and the waistband. Here we go. Stitching close to the edge all the way along, just to hold that seam allowance down, and again it makes the top edge just so much crisper and sharper. There we go, that's what it looks like on the wrong side, and on the right side you can see it's quite close to the edge there, and I'm just going to fold that in half now and give it a press. There we go, that's the waistband prepped. Okay, so now we're going to look at the frills. We've got a back frill here which has a notch at the top, and they're all clearly marked here with the size, so do mark those, and there's one on the side, and there's a double notch at the back, so that's important because you want the notches in the right place at the top. So we know this is our centre back because it's got the double notch. Okay, so I'm going to overlock this first, this centre back edge, and I'm going to put those together, making sure the notches are at the top, and stitch down. So centimetre seam allowance again, and we're going to press that open. Fab, that's our centre back seam. Again, checking where those notches are, so I know, there we go, double notch, I know that's the top. So I know this bit's the side seam. I'm going to turn this over so it's right side up now. This is the front frill. We've got a side notch again, which matches that one, and we've got a single notch at the top here, which matches the bottom of your skirt. So again, important that that's there. Just helps to distribute your gathers evenly. So this is the side seam, it's the short edge. That's easy on this front one to identify. So I've got, where am I? Here we go, I've got the back, again with the notches up, and I want to match it to the side, and I've got that curve that goes upwards at the front with the notches at the top, so I know these two edges go together. So I'm going to finish off this side seam edge first, and then I'm going to put them together, right sides together. So that's my back side seam. This is my front side seam. Both edges are finished off already, and I'm going to stitch down from the top a centimetre. And I'm going to press that open. Okay, so that's one side seam done. Now I'm going to do the same for the other. Bit easier to tell which is the top and the bottom now because you've already got one front on. But again, check the notches, overlock that side seam first or zigzag it. I like to do that first because I find it so much easier to do it and make it neater beforehand rather than trying to get in there afterwards. So double checking, triple checking, all my notches are pointing upwards. I've got the curve going up to a point at the top, and I'm putting my side seams together and I'm stitching a centimetre down as I did before. Centimetre seam allowance, press those open. Fab. So let's just triple check now that we've got everything the right way up. Okay, front, that's the right way up because the straight edge is there, the point to the side seam. Then I've got my centre back seam, and then I've got my side seam again with the upward trajectory there of the line to the centre front. Perfect, job done. Okay, so the next step is to gather. Here's my frill, centre front, and I'm just going to stitch all the way along. I'm going to stop at the seam lines. I'm going to do a double row of stitching, and I'm going to use a large stitch. So I've set my stitch on about 4.5, 5, and I am starting at the centre front, and I am stitching along 1 centimetre from the raw edge. And as I go, I'm just going to mark, as I come across a notch, I'm going to mark it with my chalk, a really big chalky mark there, just so that my notches don't get lost in the gathers when I come to pull up. So keep going until you get to a seam, and then come off and then start again. My sewing machine automatically does a little back tack at the start, so my ends will be secured. If yours doesn't, do a little back tack at the start of each one, just so that you know you're not going to lose your gathering threads. So there you go. As you come across each one, you can use a safety pin, or you can do chalk like me and just stop and start at each seam. Now I'm going back for my second row. This one is between that first row and the raw edge, so roughly 5mm in. Don't worry if it's a bit wibbly wobbly though, it doesn't really matter. Stop and start in the same way. So there you go, I've got 2 rows of stitching at the top of my frill, and I've got my big chalky notch marks as well, which is great, they're really easy to see. So this is my skirt, and I'm going to start at the centre front of my skirt, right sides together. I'm matching the seams, so I'm finding my side seam to side seam. Secure those together. Then I'm going to do centre front to centre front, so pointy bit to the centre front there, pop a pin in. Now notch, 2 big chalky notch, pop those together. Now I'm working my way to my centre back seam. So centre back seam to centre back seam, pop a pin in, notch to chalky notch. And this is my side seam. Right sides together, frill notch to skirt notch, and then we're back to the centre front on the other side. So centre front to centre front, and chalky notch to skirt notch. Okay, so that's the basics done. Now I'm going to find which end my threads are. There you go. Like I said, mine are automatically secured when I start sewing. So I'm pulling up my bobbin thread. Do secure your gathering threads if your machine doesn't do it automatically or you've forgotten to back tack. Otherwise you'll end up just pulling your threads out. And I'm just going to pull these up so that the frill is the same length as the skirt. There we go. So I'm just going to pull these gathers through so that there's an evenish amount on each side and that the frill fits nicely to the skirt. Not going to worry too much at this stage about how perfect they are because I will do that as I stitch. But what is important is that the frill is the same length as the skirt hem at the moment, so give them a little even out as you go. Plenty of pins. Again, you can always tack it before you start if that's your preferred way. So that's one panel done. And basically you want to do that for the other bits until all your frill is pinned to the whole of the skirt. There we go, look, I've pinned it all together now. And I'm going to stitch through this stitch line here, which should be about 1 centimetre in from the edge anyway, so that's our seam allowance. So as you can see, I've got a little pin here and I'm just titivating those gathers a little bit as I go, just to even them out a little bit more. And just take a little bit of time to do this because it really does make a difference to the finished garment. Remember, your stitch length is back to ordinary stitch length now. There we go. Let's take all these pins out. One frill stitched through to skirt. Amazing. I'm going to overlock the edge here now. Always love how neat this looks when you've overlocked it. Fabulous. So let's have a look at this frill. That's great. I'm going to steam mine a little bit just so that it isn't quite so poofy. Now we're going to do the front plackets. So here's my skirt, front edge, centre front. Here's my placket. As you can see, I haven't interfaced it. I don't want it bulky. I'm not actually putting buttonholes in. I have pressed my centimetre seam allowance in on one side, and I'm going to put right side to wrong side along the centre front of the skirt with that centimetre seam allowance pressed up, as you can see. As I said, I don't want a bulky placket. I'm not push that seam allowance up. I'm not going to put usable buttons and buttonholes in, so it's not going to need to be reinforced. If you want to do real buttons and buttonholes, then you will need to, or I would advise you, to use some interfacing. So stitching 1 centimetre from the top all the way down, making sure that seam lies upwards where the frill meets the skirt. Press your placket over towards your seam allowance. This is the right side now, that's the wrong side, so you can see it's all pointing away. And we're going to fold that pressed edge up too. Let me show you. You can see that seam there, that stitch line. I'm just going to put that fold ever so slightly over that stitch line, and then I'm going to stitch right on the edge of the fold there. Again, please pin or tack or whatever you feel you need to do. I'm, 30 years in, so I just kind of go for it. Okay, so that's stitched, you can see right on the edge, all the way down. I'm going to just give it a press now. Fabulous. Okay, so let's put this waistband on now. Here's my skirt, that's the top, that's the waist there. Just about see my pocket there. So here's my waistband. I pre-overlocked the edge that has the under stitching on so that I know that is not the edge that I'm stitching to my skirt. I'm going to go right sides together. Pin that side seam first. Now we're going to pin that centre back. And remember, we put a little notch in our centre back waistband that matches that seam beautifully. Now side seam again. And our other centre front. Okay, I'm going to overlap a centimetre seam allowance and pin that to the centre front of my placket. So there you can see there's an extra centimetre there. Oh, let's match those edges up nicely for my seam allowance. So I'm going to stitch from the centre front through to the side, the back, through to the other centre front, centimetre seam allowance from the edge, Fabulous. Now I'm going to trim down any sort of bulky bits at the seams. I'm not going to grade the seam though. It's very light fabric. I don't think it needs it. It's not terribly bulky. So we're just going to take these corners off, and then I'm going to show you how to finish off the centre fronts of your waistband nicely. There you go, trim off any stragglers. Okay, so we're going to fold this waistband now. You can see that's my centre front, it's the right side, so I'm folding right sides together, and I am folding it right on the edge of the waistband, and I'm folding up my centimetre seam allowance at the bottom there, and I'm going to stitch that through. Here we go. So starting at the bottom, working your way up, centimetre seam allowance. I'm just going to cut the corner off just with one stitch, just so that it's a little bit more space there. When I turn it through, it makes it look a little bit nicer. You don't have to, but it's just a little touch. So you can see that seam allowance is up towards the waistband there, and I'm going to clip that corner off, and I'm going to grade that half of the seam, and I'm going to turn it through. I'm using my scissors, which is very naughty, but I'm going to be very careful. A knitting needle is a much more safer option, or your little screwdriver that comes with your sewing machine. There we go, that's one end bagged out. Do the same for the other. Next up is elastic channels. Now I've stitched along the top edge of my waistband at the back, just the back waistband, and I've pressed my seam allowances up into the waistband. So it's just this back section that I'm going to put the elastic in. This elastic is about 1.2 mils, 1.2 centimetres, sorry. Use what you've got. I wouldn't recommend using anything over that width unless you're just going to use one piece. I'm going to lay this now under my sewing machine next to that first stitch line that I've done on the edge, the top edge of my waistband, so that I know I've got the right width for my casing. I'm going to back tack, and I'm using the guide, the stitch guide on the plate there on the sewing machine, to just keep that even so that I know I'm doing a nice even width casing for my width of elastic. So there you go, let's just check that's the right width. Yeah, that's perfect. So I'm going to do the same thing again for the second channel now. I'm going to put it under the machine, laying it next to that stitch line, making sure I've got a couple of extra millimetres wiggle room for the width of the elastic, and I'm forming my second channel. So there we go, 2 channels for my elastic. Now my elastic, I've cut half my waist width plus 2 centimetres, which is for seam allowance. So I'm using a safety pin. Old habits die hard. You might have one of those fancy elastic threader things. I'm still using a good old safety pin. So I'm going to thread my elastic through without twisting it, so keep it as flat as possible. And like I said, I'm using half my waist measurement plus 2 centimetres, so I've got 1 centimetre each side seam allowance. And I'm just going to thread it through carefully until it gets to, there's just a little tail there, and I'm going to pin that to my waistband so it doesn't disappear down my casing. I think we've all done that before. There we go, so that's secured, and I'm just going to keep pushing this pin down the channel till I get to the other side. There we go, there's my pin at the other end. Carefully pull it, like I say, make sure it's not twisted in your casing, and leave that centimetre extra for your seam allowance and pop a pin in. Just give it a little stretch to even out the gathers a bit. And I'm going to do the same with the second piece of elastic. So again, this is half my waist plus 2 centimetres. I'm going to thread that through the second channel, exactly the same way. There we go. So we've got 2 bits of elastic in there and I've secured them. I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So stitching down that seam through the elastics, do back tack through to secure them. That's it, nice firm stitch there. Okay, so I've done that both sides, so both ends are secure. I'm just trimming off the straggly threads now and just checking that the stitch is in the ditch. Incidentally, it's worth trying it on at this point to make sure that's comfortable, that elastic for you on your waist, so that you can adjust it at this point. Give it a good old stretch. You can always give it a steam if it's stretched out a little bit. And now I'm going to stitch in the ditch again, all the way along. So, starting at the centre front, I'm stitching through all the waistband underneath the skirt, stitching in that stitch line through the front, and then when we get to the side seams you just want to just separate any gathers and any bulky bits so that you can continue to stitch in that ditch all the way around the back until you get to the other front. There we go, so that's how it looks from the wrong side. Snip away any threads. That looks so neat. So with that overlocked edge flat like that, it just makes it so light around your waist. There's no bulk, no added layer on your tummy, and you can see that stitched in the ditch there. Okay, so now for the hem. We're nearly done. I've overlocked the edge, mainly because it was fraying and it was all a bit straggly, and I'm just going to turn and turn. I also find that if I've pre-overlocked it, doing a turn and turn hem, it just gives it a little bit more meat to it or something, and it just makes it easier to turn it and get a nice even hem somehow. So you'll have decided what length you want it previously. There we go, I'm just feeding that edge through as it was a little bit bulky there. And trimmed it down so you can do the hem whatever depth you want. I'm doing quite a fine one here, it's about 1/2 centimetre. There we go, give it a press. So now we're going to put these buttons on. Now, remember, these are not real buttons and buttonholes. These are just decorative. So you don't have the worry of negotiating your buttonhole on your machine. I'm just laying these plackets on top of each other. So there's an overlap of 2 centimetres at the top of the waist, and the plackets just lie directly on top of each other. I'm just going to put my buttons between the frill and the waistband. You can see there I've laid them directly on top, and I've got these little wooden buttons that I quite like here. These are, I think they're 1 centimetre, maybe slightly more. Let's have a look. Yeah, they're sort of 1 centimetre, maybe 1.1. I wouldn't use too big a buttons for it, but it's entirely your choice. It's your skirt. So this is how I'm going to do mine. I'm going to put 2 little ones at the top there because I think that looks quite nice. And then by eye, I'm just putting 1 at the top of the frill and 1 a little bit down from those 2 at the top. And then I'm going to measure between these 2 buttons here. And that's 26, so I'm going to halve that, which is 13. So I'm going to then pop another one there, so that's in the middle, and then I'm going to put two either side like that. There we go. Then I'm going to mark it with the chalk. Obviously use as many or as few as you want in your buttons. And then I'm going to stitch through the button all the way through the plackets together. You can sew your placket together if you want to, but I've left mine open, as I'll show you. Look, so it looks like it's done up with the buttons, but it's not. There we go. So elastic half waist, pockets, frill, buttons. Enjoy.